the first question is quite a broad one, as you'd have seen from the things that Bev sent over. So it's looking at sort of what aspects of the current family justice, youth justice, and child welfare systems act as obstacles for achieving good outcomes for adolescents. So we know that there's a lot of people working with teenagers, with adolescents in the system who want the best for them, but it's not always being achieved. So what do you see as the sort of main obstacles to achieving those good outcomes?
So I think, as I'd spoken to Bev quite some time ago, my expertise particular is around the justice system, not so much around the family court system. As an organisation, we don't necessarily work with adolescents or children in care. And if we do, we probably work with them when they arrive at a youth offending team. So they might be 15 to 17-year-old. And also we do some work in HMYY Wetherby. And again, they're 15 to 17-year-old young men. So you'll see that we don't necessarily work in that family court environment. We're working with young people who experience the justice system in terms of criminal justice. And I think, well, it's a broad question, so it's a broad answer. But if I can be specific around for us as an organisation, these young people are coming to adolescence at that time when that pathway of planning should kick into place. So you're going through that transition, and your transition is around becoming a child looked after and a young care leaver. And often, and invariably so, we meet with young people in criminal justice settings who don't necessarily always have that pathway of plan written up. Or if they have a pathway of plan written up, it's not necessarily being written up with them in mind, even though it's supposed to be a contract between the young person and the local authority. So those pathway plans, in terms of that assessment and understanding and taking care of their welfare needs, is not always in place in the way that it should be. And if we speak to practitioners about why that might be, some of the answers, and again, I'm not trying to generalise across the whole system here, I'm giving you the anecdotes of our experience. So practitioners will tell us, well, if the young people have been moved from worker to worker, being moved from placement to placement, or for example, if they're in care on a Section 20 and they're going between care and home, and the backwards and forwards and yo-yoing around, that pathway plan, the statutory instrument that it is in statute says if there's a change in circumstance, you must do a reassessment of that pathway plan. So a lot of the time that pathway plan doesn't get reassessed. So it becomes so complicated and so convoluted by the number of moves that them young people's needs are changing. The pathway plans are not always kept up to date. They're not always updated. And then if we look at a young person who has, for example, in a children's home in adolescence, we know children going to care in adolescence, and if they do so, they might go there on a Section 20 order. And if they go there, it's a temporary placement. But also, they've gone there because of a traumatic thing in their life. So they're going to present some traumatic behaviours. But I wonder, and this is the second point in terms of training and awareness, if those residential care workers, and we're talking about residential care in particular, particularly in the private sector, I would argue, are trained or well-versed enough to recognise traumatic behaviour, to interpret it as such, rather than immediately interpret it as deviant behaviour. Because once it becomes a deviant behaviour, it's very easy then for that to become a criminal behaviour. For example, young person in care, 15, 16 years old. I can give you one anecdote of a young lady that we worked with for years. We employed her in the end. She's now off doing her own work, but we employed her. And I met her when she was 15 in a children's home. And she'd absconded. But not absconded, she just didn't come back after the curfew. So the police got called. When the police got called, went away, picked her up, brought her back. She obviously kicked off with the police by the time she came back. There was some food that was being made in the children's home, and that food she didn't want because it's got veg in it. So she insisted she was going to make herself a pot noodle. But for her to get into the cupboard to get a pot noodle, she had to get through a locked cupboard. And the staff had said, you're not going to do that. So an argument ensues. As the argument ensues, there are then threats of her being restrained. So she picked up a ladle, big massive ladle, and said, if you come anywhere near me, I'll fucking stab you with this. So by this time the police had left. So what the residential care staff decided to do was pick up the phone the police, and said there's a girl in their home making threats to kill. So the police came out, and by the time the police came out, she was sat on the sofa in the lounge watching the TV with her arms folded and told to stand up and put her arms in the air, and they had some tasers in the side. They never pointed the tasers at her, but she was intimidated enough by all of that. And anyway, she kicked off and she got arrested. And when she got arrested, she went to the court. And then when she went to the court, she came back And she was already on a YRO, a youth rehabilitation order. And she got a 6-month extension on that. So then when I see her, I say, hey, how do you feel about all of that? And the 6-month extension, it's fantastic. Why? Because the only support that I get from a youth justice worker, so that means I can spend more time with her. So then that's my third point. The way in which children are treated in the care system and criminalised, and the support they're getting from youth justice as opposed to the social care system, becomes a perverse incentive to offending. So we've got the criminalisation of children in care for offences that would never be an offence if she was at home. We've got the training and awareness needs of these young people who are adolescents. We've got the fact that the children come into the care system in adolescence on Section 20 orders with no stability, and the planning and assessment process is not sorted. And then we've got this perverse dependence that young people have got on the youth justice system, because the social care system in their eyes is not providing the care and support that they need. Now, if you take them variables and wrap them around a young person who's in adolescence and looking to come from the cusp of care to being a care leaver and an independent young person, and then going through a transition, that means you will no longer have a social worker. You're going to have a new person who's a leaving care worker in life. And, you know, you've got to explain your story time and time and time again. So if you just look at them few issues and variables that I've mentioned there in that little anecdote that I've outlined, you can see when it comes to the criminal justice system and young people and the way they're responded to, reacted to, treated and cared for, if you want to call it care, then it begs the question as to why we wonder that some young people in the care system experience what we'd call the sharp end of social care. And then we then have the unfortunate experience of meeting them when it comes to custody. And these young people that we meet in custody. And at any time, please stop me, because I'll just talk and by all means, just bring me back in. But
please keep going off on a tangent.
And if I'm going off on a tangent, then please do tell me, because I'll just talk. But if we come to custody, we have, you know, a young person that finds themselves in custody, who might be some young person who's found it difficult to engage or to be engaged in the community. By the time they come to custody, the associations between the social care team and themselves are fractured. So they're not getting the visits, they're not getting the money what they need, they're not getting the support. So they come into prison. That very fact in itself leaves them vulnerable to exploitation in custody, because you don't have any money, you don't have any support, you don't have any resources. So what do? You go to the people you're living amongst for your support, and they get exploited. They get exploited by people that are barrening, that are gangs, that are all other kind of things happening in custody, such that they end up in debt. And once they end up in debt, then all of a sudden that experience in prison becomes an extraordinarily difficult one. And I don't need to explain to you that while these young people are going through the transition from being a child looked after to being a care leaver between 15, 16, 17 and then 18, when they turn 18, they've got to go from a young offender institute into the adult secure estate for 18 to 21. That's another transition. So you're coming from a child's prison, and it seems absurd that I use the word child and prison in the same sentence, but that's what Wetherby YOI is. It's a prison that houses children. And then you go across to Doncaster prison, for example, and they put you on their YP wing there, which is a man's prison. So you've got all of that to deal with. And as well as that, you've got a new worker in life, because you've no longer got a youth offending team officer who's going to give you a blind now and again. You've got a probation officer, an offender manager, an offender supervisor who's going to be significantly more strict with you in terms of your compliance to your sentence. That's before you've even considered being released. And that's before you've even considered having your pathway planner, i.e. your living care worker, come into custody at the age of 18 and begin to start reassessing that pathway plan, looking at what your needs are on the outside. And then that'd bring me to like a much broader issue, which might take me above and beyond what your question was. But if we have a planning and assessment process in place for young people leaving care, that's there to cater for their needs, housing, finance, education, training, etc. And then when you come into the criminal justice system, whether you go on probation, whether you go on a yacht order, or whether you go to prison, youth custody or otherwise, you're going to have a sentence plan. And that sentence plan's about compliance. And the only way you're going to be able to comply with your sentence plan, and Desistance Stevie tells us this all day long, by the way, the only way you're going to be able to go about complying with your sentence plan is if your welfare is taken care of. So therefore, we have a statutory instrument called a sentence plan. We have a statutory instrument called a pathway plan. But invariably, them two plans never seem to speak to each other. So you're asking a young person who still experience all them traumas, and by the way, them traumas will have been compounded by the experience of your journey through the justice system. You're asking them to comply with a sentence plan to then be able to resettle into the community through a resettlement plan in the absolute absence of the pathway planning process, which is there to take care of your welfare. Now, I know if I'm getting released from custody at 17, 18, 19, and I've got nowhere to live, I'm going straight back to them communities that I know and them people that I know, because they're going to accept me. And actually, I'm not going to go around to the housing, to the job centre, to the leaving care team, to the probation, because what they're going to do is they're going to make me fit into little boxes that I don't neatly fit into, and it's going to all kick off, and it's going to be difficult. So we see lots and lots of young people who are coming through the care system, bouncing in and through it, having been criminalised by the system for things would never be an offence if they were at home, finding themselves at the sharp end of social care, finding themselves in the justice system, and invariably quite lost in terms of, I have aspirations, Darren. I inspire to be someone, but you know what? I don't know how to get there, mate. I need someone to support me. And then, you know, we could put an intervention in there, which is lived experience. People like myself, you know, a care leaver, an ex-offender, able to break down some barriers when I'm speaking to young people, build a relationship, build a little bit of rapport, and have some credibility in the relationship, because it's all about relationships. It's not about ticking boxes. It's not about being able to answer to your manager about how well you've done your job. It's about building a relationship with a human being, as a human being. And to be able to do that, you need to be able to speak to them and be appreciated and have the credibility on a level. And to be able to do that, we need to be able to recognise lived experience has got a massive, massive input. But unfortunately, across the social care and criminal justice system, it's only ever given a tokenistic kind of nod and the suggestion that, yeah, you can come along and do a little bit of volunteering. No, I beg to differ. I know people that work in youth justice, that work in prisons and work in probation, who are people that have come through that lifestyle and have significantly better relationships with some of them young people. And the outcomes for them young people on the back of that are significantly better, because you find a consistent person and someone you can depend on, someone you can rely on, someone you can trust, and someone who knows a little bit about where you've been and where you want to get to. And in that way, you can help people to aspire, and you can inspire them to aspire. Sorry, that's probably a significantly longer answer to your question.
No, I mean, that's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I love the directions it went in completely. I mean, if I could just bring you back to just one quick point. I mean, when you spoke around sort of communication and consistency quite a few times there, and, you know, speaking to worker, you know, and the fact that a young person would often have to repeat their story again and again. Do you have any sort of examples of how that sort of played out in practice, or, you know, when you've spoken to young people, how that impacts and affects them?
Well, I mean, the very short answer to that is they just give up saying it. They get to a point where it's like, you know what, I'm sick and tired of telling people. And also, it's difficult for some young people sometimes when you have to explain your story, because if you've come into the care system, and we often meet young people that have had a foster placement, that's not work. So you get a residential placement, a local one, that doesn't work. So you get an out of bounds one, that doesn't work. So you get yourself a secure placement because you keep on disappearing on welfare grounds. And then you'll find yourself going through all these different parts of the care system with your social worker trying to find you the right placement. It's not working, but you're repeating your story time and time again. But each time you repeat your story, it's becoming more and more fragmented because you're bouncing around all the time. So then when you get to a point of speaking to a probation officer, for example, who doesn't know anything about the social care system and what it is to be a care leaver or a child looked after, you're now speaking to a professional as a young adult about experiences that are so fragmented that there's so many holes in your story, you lack the confidence to be able to articulate it. And so a program that we deliver is called Clear Approach. And we put that together with a group of men we worked with in HMP Risley about 7 or 8 years ago. And the simple basic premise of it is using that credibility, that lived experience, to develop a conversation with a young person that helps them to identify the different strings that piece together the different parts of their life. And then what we do is we pull together a group of young people and give them an opportunity in the town hall of any said region, for example, Leeds, Liverpool, wherever it might be, and invite all of the statutory leads, i.e. those strategic leads that sit in the ivory towers, invite them to come down, sit in front of these young people and listen to the presentations. And they present through music, through poetry, through PowerPoint, whatever they want. But by the time they get to the point of doing that, they've sat with us, they've worked with us, and they've been able to string together all the different fragments of their life, pull it into a story that they become confident in articulating. And just that, you might call that a soft outcome. I call that probably one of the hardest outcomes you will ever want to achieve, because that young person now is confident in talking about who they are, can stand up in front of an audience and do it, and also can do it in front of those people that are essential because they run the services that they need to engage, which is essential for their better outcomes. So now them young people are able to think, actually, you know what, I can go down to the housing, I can go down to the benefits office, I can speak to my Job Centre Plus advisor, I can get an answer from a housing officer that I don't want and still be able to deal with it and still be able to manage that. I can speak to my yacht worker and my probation worker and all those other people that are professionals more confidently because I know my story, because I've put it together, because it's here, because it makes sense to me. And that's what we get from a lot of young people all the time. It's difficult for them sometimes in a criminal justice setting to articulate their story without feeling like they're being judged, without feeling like someone's suggesting they're trying to make excuses for their offending behaviour, and without having to kind of question yourself, because when you tell your story, you're not articulating it as well as you want to do because there are so many fragments to it. So be able to defragment that and pull it back together is massively, massively important.
I mean, that sounds incredible. Just out of interest, how do the sort of strategic level people, how do they respond to those stories?
They sometimes respond well and they sometimes don't respond well. We had one good response, for example, from a young girl who'd been placed in a secure, on welfare grounds. She was put into a secure kids home. And her answer she wrote a poem, and the poem that she wrote, she was a young black girl, and she's quite animated in the way she speaks and comes from a certain area and that's got a reputation. And I think the way she's animated and the way she speaks and the area that she's from, all that precedes her. And there's a paper self as well. So all of the social workers had always written reports about working with her and said how difficult she was and stuff. So all of that precedes her. So her poem was about the way you perceive me. You just don't understand me. You don't get me. And look what you've done. You've put me effectively in a prison as a young girl who's never committed an offence amongst a lot of other people that have committed offences that I would never even dream of doing. And you say that's for my welfare. So she spoke to them as though they were the crazy ones. As though you've put me into an environment that is making my welfare, my mental well-being, my mental health worse than it even was beforehand. Anyways, on the back of that, the chief executive of this said council had spoke to me and the worker that was working with this girl and asked if we could arrange a meeting between her, ourselves and him and a couple of the psychologists and social workers. And you know what? She got released. They got her a flat. They released her. They got her a flat and gave her some round-the-clock support. So they'd have carers coming around to her house in the morning, coming around in an evening and coming around in the afternoon. And then that kind of support would taper off as she got more and more settled in the place where she is. About 7 months later, the head of the Leaving Care Service came and said, I was in a bar with my wife the other night. And there was some girl up on the stage and she was talking and she was rapping and saying poetry. And guess who it was? This girl. You know what I mean? So she should become so confident in herself and it touched her in such a way that she wanted to go out there. And now she works with that particular youth offending team. We set up a group called CARE. And the CARE group, the acronym is Challenge and Raise Expectations. And these are young people that have come through the Clear Approach programme and then come back into the programme beyond its lifetime and decided to kind of put together some training packages and go out there, speak to foster carers and social workers and other people. I'm not involved in that. It's the youth offending team worker that was part of the project that continues that. But she's a central part of that group. So yeah, absolutely. An example of how the strategic leads can respond, because sometimes they do sit in those ivory towers and they don't see what's happening on the ground. And they need to listen to what these young people have got to say about how they experience the care system and the youth justice system.
That's great. I mean, that's all so interesting. Thanks again. I'm just going to go into the second question now.
Okay.
Which is
I'll keep the answers short, all right?
No, I mean, they're fantastic, Darren. Please don't. But again, I guess, as you know, I've said before today, that this is probably going to be a bit more of a difficult question. And it's, identifying the three things that you feel are worth keeping, in the current system, whether that's the family justice, youth justice, or child welfare system, or that you feel could be helpful if they were in a different guise or in a different context to, in the sense of supporting adolescents and, in your case, care leavers.
So the three things that we should keep in place. So I've just talked about a lack of trauma-informed approaches in the care system, but that doesn't mean there aren't any. There are some. And what we should be doing is we should be looking at that good practice where that trauma-informed approach works for better outcomes, because we should be able to identify that. There should be some research that goes out there and identifies where them practices are working well. Take that practice and feed that back through. I don't know whether that comes through the DFE or wherever else, to make sure that that practice is shared more widely. There should be a hub where you could go to, maybe through the Department for Education, and there's some good practice. This has worked well for us, and that should be shared. And that's the problem with good practice. It isn't shared well enough. But that doesn't mean it's not out there, because it is. And I might sound like I come from a very pessimistic view, but actually I'd like to be more positive and say, look, if there's practice out there, what we want to do is be made redundant by not being having to be out there for campaigning for improvements. We want to be out there shouting and screaming about how great the system is. So I think there's opportunities out there to be able to share good practice around trauma-informed approaches. I think if we're talking about custody and youth custody and YOs, we have at the moment social work teams in those YOs. And I work well with that social work team in HMYY Wetherby. And them men and women on that team know the ins and outs of legislation to be able to protect and support them young people, to make sure that they do get as much of a service as what they can. So those teams need to remain, but those teams need to be given a little bit more teeth, because actually, when they do get in touch with leaving care teams and try to get them to live up to the statutory obligations, sometimes it's difficult. And that might be difficult because we've only got 4 YOs in the whole country. That means they're a national resource. So that means you can be a long, long way away from your leaving care team. If you're up here in Yorkshire, you might be from London. And so therefore it's difficult for that communication. And so maybe using those social work teams, there should be more around video conferencing, video calling, opportunities for them young people to be able to speak directly to the social care teams that are going to support them through them transitions between becoming a child looked after, a care leaver, and a young man or woman that's going to go across to that adult secure estate. So I think the social work teams are a positive, but they need to be given a bit more teeth in terms of being able to advocate for some of them young people to ensure some of those communications stay where they are. And then the third thing would be, I don't think off the top of my head here. So, I mean, we talked about the planning and assessment process, and I talked about it being invariably not there. But again, in the same way as the trauma-informed approach is invariably not there. Sometimes it is, and sometimes the pathway planning process is there. And I can give examples of how I've been in touch with a leaving care service myself for a young man who's been in custody. He's reached the age of 22, 23 at the end of a long sentence. Wasn't aware he's entitled to any support, but we've been able to get in touch with a leaving care team who's responded well, who sat down with the sentence planner, put together a pathway plan that mirrors and complements that sentence plan, such that that young person completely changes the way they respond to the prison, changes the way they respond to the idea of getting released, become less pessimistic and more positive and have a greater outlook, which then leads to significantly better outcomes. So for me, it would be around that trauma-informed approach, them teams that work in custody around young people and support them through them transitions, and the planning and assessment process. I'd keep them 3 things, but I'd suggest some improvements in the way that I've just suggested it.
That's great. Thanks, Darren. Just in terms of the sort of the leaving care teams and the planning that you were speaking about there, I mean, it's something that's been raised in other conversations we've had about the communication between the sort of leaving care teams and the secure estate and people working in the youth prisons and things like that. Is there something that you can see there that's, where it's worked well, that communication, whether what we've heard before is, that leaving care teams aren't actually aware that a young person is coming out of custody until the day or 2 days before they're supposed to be leaving? I mean, have you heard of any sort of, good practice around that and, anywhere that it could be sort of improved?
I do. So there's lots of good practice. And if you look in the Midlands, excuse me, the East and West Midlands. So the Ministry of Justice and HMPPS have put together a semblance of structure. So we now have a national care leaver champion who sits on a forum run by HMPPS. We have a operational lead for care leavers across custody and regional champions. So there's a regional champion for London, for Yorkshire, and so on and so forth. And because the national care leaver champion is the DDC for all of the prisons across the Midlands, she's able to use her sway to kind of ensure that there's better practice in prisons, between prisons and social care teams. So there's quite a good working group of local authorities, healthcare professionals and criminal justice professionals that meet on a regular basis across the West Midlands, ensuring that young people that are coming into custody are fully supported from the beginning all the way through to the end in terms of that planning and assessment process. So there are examples across the Midlands, what I'm saying, where you can look at the sentence planning and the pathway planning working much better together. And when that does work well together, invariably what that means is a three-way meeting between the young adult, the pathway planner, and the sentence planner. And then that young person is not talking to various different people, but just talking to them two people. And then when you come from custody into the community, you get what's called an offender manager. But that offender manager is also involved. So you get an offender supervisor in custody, an offender manager when you get released. The offender supervisor passes the case over to the offender manager, but the offender manager is the one that's responsible for saying when you should get released and where it is you can live, etc. So when you bring all of that together and tie it all up, the young person just feels like, my head's not so blagged. I'm not talking to so many different people, and actually everyone seems to be communicating effectively about me right now, and it gives them confidence then in being able to respond well. And that's when you're going to get the better outcomes, because if you can give an individual ownership over that planning and assessment process, they're going to invest themselves in it. Whereas if you put together all these predefined boxes and call them outcomes and expect that person to sit in it, and say, well, that's not the outcome I want in my life, so I'm not going to be invested in it. But if you give them an opportunity to say what they want and help them to get where they need to be, then they're going to invest themselves in it.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Darren. Mike, I don't know if you want to come in and ask the third question now.
Yeah. I just want to say, first of all, massive respect to you, Darren, because you've made a million points that I think this whole film could be considered as a dispatch. You said a lot of things that are under the surface that a lot of people are unaware about, what happens within practice, within the relationships between young care leavers and the professionals. So I think your perspective is so valued right now. And coming with the final question, I'm gonna aim at so the value of lived experience. So what would your vision for the future of lived experience be?
My vision for the future of lived experience would be for the government to stop telling lies to us and stop suggesting that people like me can come into the system, use our insights with our lived experience and our professional capacity to bring those tools together and make one really, really powerful tool, and stop being so scared of it. So stop telling me and stop telling my colleagues and other people. I've got colleagues that have written books. I've got colleagues that work in youth justice. I've got colleagues that work all over the place that come from a background like me. And they're not going to rob anyone. They're not going to help anyone escape from prison. They're not going to do anything wrong. If you let us come in and have some real meaningful relationships, we can make a real meaningful difference. For example, I came out of prison in 2004 was my last time. I got released and I built my life since then. That's a long, long time ago. But when I go into a prison now, they don't give me no keys. Still don't give me no keys. And all my offences, by the way, was as a young offender. It's not as like an adult offender. So, and the offences that I committed were not such that, they're going to suggest I'm going to do something crazy. I get picked up at the gatehouse. I get taken to where I'm going to be. I get observed in the work that I'm doing, and then I get taken back out of the prison. And I do that and explain to people that I'm doing this from a user-led, a lived experience perspective. And some of the people I'm working with are saying, but you know what? With that dude sat in the corner there, it's a bit difficult to have the conversation we want to be able to have because it restricts it. So what I'm saying to you is that's one example of a broader issue. And the broader issue is the justice system, the criminal justice system says we value lived experience and its input in being able to help us achieve our outcomes. But they put a ceiling there and they allow you to come in and get so far. And when you get so far, it's like, well, you're not getting no further. But you know what? If I come in as a volunteer and then become a practitioner and then I become a manager and then I become a senior strategic lead, I should be able to go higher and higher and higher up like anybody else would in terms of career progression. But what that career progression is doing is getting curtailed because they don't want you to go so high. They want you to keep you at a certain place. So they allow you in. Lived experience is looked at tokenistically, in my opinion. And for that reason, it doesn't have the impact that it's going to have. I've just been working with, and there's a group of us working with an organisation called Criminal Justice Alliance. And a report was written called Change from Within. And, the title itself speaks for itself. And that speaks a lot about a lot of organisations that have got credibility, a lot of individuals that have got an offending background, but actually I've got a lot to give, but still find themselves restricted and almost patronised by a justice system that says we want your input, but that input's only allowed to go so far. So for me, my aspiration for lived experience would be to allow us to come in and make a real difference and give us the autonomy to be able to work within your institutions, both at a policy level and a practice level, with real meaningful opportunities, because that's the only way you're going to get is and allow us to make real meaningful differences. I hope that answers your question.
I mean, I think Mike might have just dropped off, Darren. I think only for the last sort of 10 seconds of what you were saying.
Yeah, I can see he's dropped off.
But no, that did, I think for me, answered the question. But I just wanted to follow up a little. Oh, here he is. Mike's back, actually. I'll let him ask his follow-up first, and then I'll come in.
So sorry about that. My internet is so terrible.
Yeah.
Mike, I didn't know if you wanted to ask a follow-up question to Darren, or if you wanted him to repeat anything.
Are you there, Mike?
Okay. Well, while we're waiting for him for Mike to come back, I mean, it was just a follow-up question, Darren, on again on that the lived experience, but in terms of what your vision would be in terms of service design, working, co-produced with people with lived experience, whether you have a vision for how that could potentially work as well.
Well, I mean, in the first instance, I think there'd need to be some kind of research to understand what that lived experience can offer, to be able to identify what co-production looks like, to be able to define what co-production is, because a lot of people will define and understand and experience co-production in very different ways. And I've seen some projects out there that are apparently co-produced, but they're not particularly well co-produced because the individuals that have got the lived experience are just simply a tag on and a justification for funding bids and stuff. So I think in the first instance, it'd be about going out there and doing some research and having some understanding and develop some terms of reference as to what lived experience actually means, and ensuring that your service design and your service delivery recognises that, yes, it's going to come with risk, but everything comes with risk. But don't allow the justice system to continue with its overly and oppressive risk-averse nature. It needs to look at itself a little bit. And that's kind of one of the issues, I think, in terms of the justice system as a whole, in terms of it's a risk-averse. And naturally, you can understand why it is risk-averse in many respects, of course. But there should be some mitigations and qualifications within that risk and how that risk is measured and how that risk is used to be able to allow people with a lived experience to come in and work within the system. And if you're going to allow us to come in and work with you, then make sure your service design allows for that autonomy and freedom for you to work within it. So you don't keep looking over your shoulder, because that's one of the issues. If you're looking over your shoulder, wondering who's watching, or you're thinking you're being observed, then you're not going to be able to be free enough to just do the work what you need to do in the way you need to do it to make the difference that you need to make. So I think research is massively important in terms of understanding what lived experience means, how that kind of fits into a service design within the context of risk, reducing that risk-averse nature of the justice system, and to actually think a little bit about what does co-production mean. If you're talking about co-production, is it real? Is it honest? Or is it just another method of tokenistically inviting people with a lived experience into the system? And I do apologise if some of my answers feel like I'm on a soapbox or something. I'm quite passionate about the thing. I work in the environment every day and I do what I do. So if my passion comes across, I do apologise for that. It's just...
Do not apologise for your passion for 1 second.
Keep
honestly.
the passion, keep the passion, keep it.
Yeah,
so I hope that answered the question, yeah.
It really did. Mike, I don't know if you wanted to ask your follow-up. Sorry, your internet cut out a little bit before.
Do you know what? Yeah, I just want to say you gave me goosebumps with some of the things that you said, because there's like the anecdote of the young girl that you was talking about in that situation. I'm a young person that has been through a similar situation with a similar scenario happening, and it's like history repeating itself. And how do we break that cycle? I went through that, 12 years ago. What about another person? When are they going to go through it? So it's how do we break that cycle? How do we break these stigmas? How do we protect the future generations? And I think you've Yeah, I think you said it.
Yeah, Mike, and I think we're just out there, I guess. And a little bit of background about the Kelvins Association, if nobody knows, we are an entirely user-led charity. We don't live off government funding. We live off funding which is independent of the government, which means we can beg the critical questions, if you like. But we have a board of trustees, all who are care experienced themselves. We have a director, myself as a project manager, project workers, coordinators and volunteers, all of whom have kind of come through the care system. Myself come through the justice system, but everybody else has come through the care system. And we just a group of like-minded people, I guess, that seek to campaign and lobby. And the reason why we can give you the anecdotes that we do is not because we provide a service, because we don't have capacity to be able to provide a service, but some of the ways in which we engage means we speak to people who tell us a lot about their stories and their lives. And when they do that, you can identify the gaps through which they're falling. And it makes you angry. And it makes you angry enough that you go out there and you advocate for these young people and for adults as well. And in advocating, you end up kind of developing a service quite by accident, and people are coming and asking for a lot of support. And we don't always have the capacity to be able to provide, but we can use a lot of that work in our arguments in terms of our campaigning and lobbying. So I just wanted to outline there in terms of the Kelvins Association. It's important for you to recognise that we're an entirely user-led charity and completely independent as well. And I'm not quite sure who's going to hear this film or where it might be, but we do not have an advice line as such. We just have a telephone number, and people phone us up all the time and ask us a question about whether or not they're being told the truth about what it is they should expect from the care system and leaving care, and they can be assured of an independent and honest answer and some advocacy if needed. There's the advert done. That's
great, Darren. No, honestly, that is great. I mean, just a follow-up question to that. I mean, how do you think you increase the trust there? You know, I know what you said is, you know, you get young people calling you up and saying, you know, how can I trust what I've heard? How do you increase the trust in the system?
So, well, I mean, what we don't do is speak to young people and start saying, you know, your leaving care worker, your social worker is a bad person. Of course, we want to encourage that relationship. But in and amongst encouraging that relationship, we're also able to be honest because we understand the law and the legislation, rights and entitlements. We're also be able to help that individual understand what should or shouldn't be happening when they're coming to the cusp of care or when they're going into custody, but also to encourage them to recognise that if they're armed with the knowledge that they need, go back and speak to the leaving care worker or the social worker, but do that in a different way to what you might have done before. Because if you do throw a mobile phone in the red, they're probably not going to respond very well to you. But we completely understand where that mobile phone might get thrown out of sheer frustration. But to be able to increase the trust between that young person and that leaving care worker, for example, you arm them with the knowledge that they need to be able to argue their case in a more articulate and more appropriate way. And that in itself maybe sometimes encourages a more trusting relationship. But young people have also got the right to go back to leaving care team and say, do you know what? I need to change my worker because that's not working for me. And one of the things I've outlined before is the idea of a paper self. It's unfortunate that a lot of young people are told that they're difficult to engage. I beg the question, actually. Maybe it's the practitioner that's difficult to engage. Maybe the young person is doing everything right. The practitioner is doing everything wrong. However, the young person doesn't write the file. The practitioner does. So in that file, it gets written down as the young person being difficult. Well, actually, maybe the young person should have a little bit of input into that file and write down about how difficult that practitioner was. So then in future, that manager can think a little bit about how that practitioner does their work in a different way. Because when I sit down and speak to young people, and bear in mind, I'm not a social worker, so I'm not professionally trained, and I seem to manage it all right, you know what I mean? We have some great relationships, a little bit of banter, but in and amongst all the banter and the way we present ourselves is this kind of underlying, we're going to get from A to B to C, and you're going to take responsibility for getting there. It's not my job to make that relationship between that young person and leaving care service negative. It's my job to try to encourage a positive relationship. But in so doing, we'll not be backwards in coming forward and calling out bad practice. And we will never, under any circumstances, allow a young person to be presented as the negative part of that relationship, because that's just not right. So in that way, you kind of develop trust and build trust between yourself and that individual and the worker that they're working with.
That's great. Thanks so much, Darren. Mike, I saw again you cut out again, but I don't know if you wanted to ask anything else.
Do you know what? My internet's terrible. If I ask anything, it's probably going to cut me out. But I have one more question, personal query. Are you guys connected with the Care Leaver Covenant or the National Leaving Care Benchmarking Forum?
Yeah, so we are connected to both, actually. So the National Care Leaving Benchmarking Forum, I know Alice Frank. I think Alice might have left, actually. And I know a couple of other people that kind of work on that forum. And so, yeah, we consistently engage with that forum. And then in terms of the Covenant, yes, I know Matthew well. Matthew that heads up the thing. We started doing a little piece of work in HMP Leeds with some care leavers. And that kind of work in Leeds is developed now such that they've managed to get some funding to employ a worker that works in prisons across Yorkshire and Humber and works in prisons across the Midlands. And what that person's job is to do is to identify people that have come through the care system and support them into employment and other kind of opportunities. So, yeah, we know the Covenant well, and we know the National Leaving Care Benchmarking Forum well. And we do feed into that forum sometimes the good practice we see and sometimes the not so good practice that we see.
Yeah, that cleared my curiosity.
Yeah.
Wicked.
Great. I had one more follow-up question, probably a few more as well. But I know you mentioned right at the start when we were speaking, and this is a sort of broader issue around sort of the criminalisation of young people in care or in secure accommodation. And there's been various reviews and recommendations in terms of this is an issue, this is what we need to do. Sort of in your view, why hasn't that changed, or why hasn't it changed at the pace it needs to since those reviews have come out?
Because the care system's broken and fragmented. And so therefore we have, for example, if you go back to 2016, Lord Layman, through the Prison Reform Trust, did a review. We were part of that review. And we put together a group of young people who advised that group and that review. We're also members of it. I did a lot of work with Baroness Lola Young around this issue as well. And there was a series of recommendations written into that. Akin to that, we ourselves as an organisation did a number of roundtables between 2014 and 2019. We just produced a report. I can see the link to that report in the email that Bev sent through to me. And what that report does, and Lord Layman's report, he sets out a series of recommendations in terms of the criminalisation of children in care. And much of that speaks to many of the issues that I talked about in the first instance around the planning and assessment process, about their transition from becoming a child looked after to becoming a care leaver, but also massively about them trauma-informed approach and about the way in which practitioners in residential care settings in particular work with young people that come into care in adolescence, and also the absolute outrageous, illegal in my opinion, use of Section 20. There were lots and lots of young people that come into care on a Section 20, and unless they come into care at a particular time and stay in care across a certain age range and cover that 13 weeks, by the time it comes to that time in care under Section 20, you don't qualify for a service from any leaving care worker in any event. So when we talk about the definitions of a care leaver, we talk about a very narrow definition of a specific group of young people that were looked after between the ages of 14 and 16, including your 16th birthday, by the way. So you have to be in care on your 16th birthday to get a cake, and for 13 weeks or more, unless, of course, you come into care post 16 and then you do them 13 weeks. If you don't fit within that group, then you don't qualify for no service, and you completely tail off. And then that ignores all of those other groups that sit around that are massively in need of support. I'm not sure that answered your question. I went for the tangent there, but I did answer it to begin with, I think.
No, you did. You definitely did. Thanks, Darren. I don't know if Bev or Seth wanted to come in and ask anything else.
I definitely do, if I'm allowed. That's really just so, there's just so much meaty stuff in there, and it's so great to hear someone actually in and amongst the action. I'm just trying to work out which point is best to pick up on. I love the inspire to aspire, and the constant, the way that you're suggesting how important a consistent person is. And I know that is something that doesn't happen anywhere near enough. How do you think we can make steps towards there being a more consistent person?
I think it comes down to relationships, Seth. It's everything. I mean, we are human beings at the end of the day. It's about relationships. And also, do you know what? you're going to come and work in the care system, be prepared for the fact that you're going to come into an area where you're going to be working with some difficult young people, but be prepared to develop a relationship with them, much in the same way as you develop a relationship with your own children. Within the context of professional boundaries, of course. I'm not saying come into care and start being mum and dad, but do you know what? I grew up as a child, I don't think anyone when I was a kid told me that they loved me. No one ever sat me on the knee and said, you're going to be safe. And do you know what? I meet a lot of kids now. I'm 49 years old. I should not be able to sit down with a 15-year-old and then when they're talking to me, reflect on my own life and see a mirror of me in them when I'm talking to them now at 15. It's wrong. Just love them. That's it. Just love them. Show some love. I'm not saying sit them on your knee and give them a cuddle or do all of that. I understand all the safeguarding and stuff. I'm not silly, but I'm also a human being and they're human beings. And I can show respect and love to a young person, without touching them. I can absolutely do that. And them kids, they respond to it and they love it and they like it. And that's it. And do you know what? When they feel like you love them or you care for them or you're invested in them, they want a relationship with you. So the relationship's easy. And once they want a relationship with you, all you've got to do is just step above and beyond a little bit. A few more steps up the ladder. And you can keep the relationship and you can maintain it. And every time they come down to office, they'll be asking for you anyway. Or otherwise, if your phone's turned off at 5, just leave it on till 7 and let them give you a call. I had a young boy who called me up on Sunday. I answered my phone to him and I sat on the phone for an hour and 45 minutes. And he's telling me how his mental health is doing his head in that particular day. All I did is I told him to get up, get out of the house and go for a walk because it was sunny. He got up, he went out of the house, he went for a walk and called me back when he got home and he was fine. That's it. It's not rocket science, but because we professionals, social workers, the whole system has to work within that system. I think sometimes people come into the profession and they've got all these aspirations because they want to be this and they want to be that and they want to do good. And then the system just sucks them dry. It just sucks the life out of them because they're sat behind a desk or behind a computer writing this assessment or that assessment or doing this, and the relationships are not there. So yeah, it's about relationships. And actually, if you're working with a kid in care, the fact that kid is in care, right? That kid has come through some experiences that you as an adult probably haven't been through yet, and probably knows a little bit more about life than what you're already knowing. All they need is a little bit of encouragement to aspire to be someone. So you have to inspire them. And I was speaking to a friend the other day about relationships and young people in care and justice and how they keep going back to the same old networks and the same old places. You know why? They go back to the same old networks and the same old places and find themselves back in trouble because nobody's given them permission to be in a new environment where they can be accepted. All we want to do is be accepted. And if we can be accepted in a new environment that's more positive for us, we'll probably be able to aspire to the things that we want. But if we don't feel accepted and we feel judged in them spaces that are good for us, we're not going to choose them places. We're going to go to them places that are bad for us all the time because that's the easiest place to go to get the acceptance that you're looking for.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, I feel like I just want to keep asking you more questions, but can I just ask you one more? Because you talked about a certain type of research that would be needed to sort of make the benchmarks of like what it is that we could actually define lived experience as, so that it might become a bit more recognized amongst the hierarchies. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but that was kind of what you're suggesting.
Sure, yeah.
Do you know what? Could you maybe just elaborate on that and talk about who we might even need to mobilize to start that process?
I think, there are some organisations out there. I mentioned the Criminal Justice Alliance. And the Criminal Justice Alliance is a voluntary sector organisation, and it's a member-led organisation, and all the members of that organisation do come from the voluntary sector. And all of us that are in there have got people that have got a lived experience on their organisation, in their organisation, and our views and our experiences are completely valued within that group. And I'd employ you therefore to go to the Criminal Justice Alliance's website and look at their report called A Change From Within, and maybe speak to Nina Champion, who's the director of the Criminal Justice Alliance, and she could talk to you a little bit about lived experience and some of the work what they're doing, because they've got a bigger campaign than what we have. I'm just giving you my one voice. And if you needed to speak to other people who I work very well with, I mean, I've got a friend called Andy Briley. He's just written his second book, and his second book is about relationships. And me and Andy, all the work I talked to you about, clear approach. I never knew him till 8 years ago. I went over to Leeds Yacht and I started doing some work. and started talking to him in a toilet. And it turns out that he's an ex-offender and he's been to the same prison as me, and he's come from the care system and he's from Yorkshire. And we had a little bit of banter. And you know what? We did all that work and made all that difference with all them kids. And he manages that care group now, what I talk about. But also, we become best friends. We're absolute best friends. You know, I went to his wedding and you know, so we kind of build them relationships, about relationships. But yeah, just read Andy's book. I think it comes out on the 16th of March. Andy Brierley. I can't give you the title of the book, but Bev might be able to tell you. But hey, read that book, and that book will tell you a lot about relationships and that lived experience and its value.
So to allow the space for those relationships in a professional context, do you think we need to just perhaps like stop the focus on outputs and maybe look towards outcomes? Or how do we change that? How do we get that space, or the, you know, a feel that we've even got the opportunity to make those relationships as professionals?
I think you have to change the narrative. I think we have to have the system. The system needs to sit up and take note of itself and take response. So we say to individuals all the time, you need to sit up and take responsibility and change your behaviour. Well, I say to the system, you need to sit up, take responsibility and change your behaviour. Don't be telling me to change who I am and the way that I am if you can't change yourself. So the system needs to sit up and take responsibility to change its behaviour. And when I say do that, I mean, stop trying to define outcomes for me that you think are best for me without having got the chance to get to know me. And that's where lived experience comes in, because lived experience will help you get to know an individual in a way that another practitioner or professional is not able to. If you can understand the individual, the individual will tell you what their outcomes need to be. And then you can support them to achieve their outcomes rather than tell them what the outcomes need to be and then shout at them when they're not jumping into them boxes and those outcomes that you've predefined for them. Because you know what? If you go to Bracken Hall is an estate that I spent a lot of time on as a boy, yeah? And some white middle-class social worker comes onto that estate and starts telling all them people how to live. They're going to laugh her off the estate because she doesn't know anything about it. But if someone from the community centre comes in and says, these are the outcomes we need for our estate, people are going to invest themselves in that. So you need to flip it. You need to turn it upside down. The whole narrative needs to change. It needs to be about the person, being more person-centred. And the way to get to a more person-centred approach is to accept the real value of lived experience.